Welcome to this Communitas podcast. This particular discussion is going to be about law, or the law, about rules in our life, about what they tell us about God, about how we are to understand them, how we are to apply them. We want to have this as a discussion and not just as part of a sermon, though of course it will be part of a sermon, because it really is hard to get the right balance. Even among the Communitas preaching team, we had a couple-week discussion, just figuring out how do we want to present our series. And we've kind of ended up using the letter R to think through what's going on in the book of Exodus. So it starts with rescue, and then there's a relationship, and that's all for purposes of representing who God is. But we also are going to talk about rules, because somehow or another rules fit in there. And we had quite a discussion about whether we even wanted that in kind of this simple format of the book of Exodus, or what kind of words to use. And because we're using ours, we're going to use the word rules, but generally rules in quotation marks, because it's hard to know what do they mean and how important are they. And like I said, it's even a bit of a disagreement that we had, just trying to figure out what is the best way to talk about the place of rules in our life. And so I'm not sure that John is even 100% comfortable, with my formulation of rules, but I'm going to give him an opportunity to express his thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think rules can communicate the right thing, but they are potentially misleading. I think it's important to recognize that the big word that describes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy is Torah. And Torah does not mean rule. It means more teaching or direction or life direction. And I think the idea of life direction, so the 10 Commandments could be translated 10 words. It's simply the 10 things. And one of the ways we looked at this was looking at how in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 1, which is an important chapter in Deuteronomy, the first verse describes the commandment, the statutes, and the rules or ordinances. And the suggestion is that there is one commandment, and of course in Deuteronomy 6 it is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength, which is obviously picked up by Jesus. A reminder that the response that God's people in the Old Testament and New Testament primarily give to God is to love him. And then there's one rule, or one commandment there, and then there are 10 words, what we describe as the 10 Commandments, that give some shape to what it means to loving God. Some boots on the ground, rubber hits the road kind of descriptions of how we are to live. And then there are hundreds of ordinances, rules about lots of details, many of which are details that are situational because of the people of Israel living at that time in the desert. And there are things which are related to them nationally and ceremonially, and dealing with institutions which are no longer established in every country, like slavery, for example. So I think thinking of those three stages is a helpful way of thinking about this, and not enshrining the 10 words as being necessarily above everything else, putting them on the wall. If we're going to put anything on the wall, it should be love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. Because that reminds us that what God's looking for is a relationship, not compliance.
Well, I want to camp on the word relationship, because we, for convenience for this series, we're using ours.
Yes.
But if we were using e's, a good word, I think, would be expectations, because in any good relationship, there are expectations, and there are necessary expectations, and that's not a sign of there's something wrong in that relationship that one people, so for instance, in our marriage, if I can pat myself on the back a little bit, more or less, my wife expects coffee in the morning. Now, she didn't demand that. That wasn't a rule, but that was something I just started to do very early. And so now, more or less, I do that. I bring her coffee in bed in the morning. So that's a kind of expectation that is good for our relationship. Not exactly a rule, but there are things that are more critical in the sense that if I miss it, it's really bad. If I miss a birthday or a name's day, that's really not good. It affects relationship. And then, some things shouldn't just be an expectation, but, you can call it a rule or a law, like don't commit adultery. That, in a marriage relationship, that, in a sense, I would say it's a legitimate expectation for sure, but it's such a vital expectation that to write it as a law, if it's necessary to write it as a law, then it actually makes sense because it's a relationship.
Yes, and I think it depends on the temperament of people. If you say to some people, you are to show your love to God and show your love to other people, they can immediately get it. They're perhaps imaginative or intuitive, and they respond to that in a very dynamic way. Some people, it just wouldn't occur to them that something they do might show their love to another person, or something they don't do will show that they're perhaps not being loving towards that person. Now, it might just be men, or it might just be me, but my wife finds that it's kind of helpful sometimes to put signs up, please close the fridge, don't forget to lock the front door, don't spit into the kitchen sink. No, that's not one that she does. But sometimes we do need some help with having some shape to how we love God. And of course, the 10 words do give us some shape. With your language, when you're talking about God, you need to talk about God in appropriate terms. When you're thinking about your time, you need to think about how you apportion your time in relationship to God. When you're thinking about your relationship to truth and your relationship to your neighbour's wife and property and reputation, these are words which kind of give you some shape and guidance to show what your love for God and other people might look like. And that's a very useful thing for some of us who perhaps lack imagination or motivation.
When we think about contemporary Christians that we know, whether people in your church or so forth, as you observe the landscape, what are some dangers that come with overemphasizing law or rules? What does faith look like when it's rule bound, and what does it look like when it has shape but not rule bound?
Well, I think that one of the challenges of a law-dominated view of God is that we feel that we can do what's been demanded of us, and that if we comply, well, then therefore God must be pleased with us and everything's okay. So, for example, we see that with the man who comes to Jesus in Mark 10, and when Jesus speaks to him about the commandments, he said, I've kept all of these since my youth. And of course, Paul likewise said in Philippians 3 that according to the law, he was faultless. So there is a kind of compliance which we kind of tick box, which has a certain effect on us. We kind of feel that maybe we've kind of done what's necessary, but I think also we kind of feel that maybe we're now entitled. We're entitled to God's favour because we've done the thing. We've put our coin into the chocolate machine, and therefore we deserve the chocolate bar to come out at the bottom. Of course, there is also this interaction with law that makes people feel defeated. They kind of feel that they've constantly got 9 out of 10 or 7 out of 10, and they're never going to make the grade. They're never going to feel accepted. And I think both of those things are potentially quite harmful. But we were chatting earlier in the week about the story of the two sons, the father and the two sons. The boy who says to his dad, "I wish you were dead, give me the money," finally comes back because he thinks that being a servant in his father's household and being close to the father is the best thing for his life. The older son, who's been there all the time and is put in the shift and obeyed all the rules, is really cross about the father welcoming the son back, the younger son back. And he, although he's been in the house of the father all of the time, does not feel close to the father because he has the mindset of a servant. Whereas the son who is willing to be a servant of his father in order to be in his father's household is acting more like a son. And I think that there is the sense in which it's possible for Christians to be more like a servant, a slave, than a son or a daughter in the house. Now, of course, the other side of it is that you can have a kind of an antinomian, an anti-law approach to the words that you have in the Ten Commandments and so on, that is just so loose and is so shapeless that people do as they please. Now, Augustine famously said, "Love God and do what you like." Now, the danger of a statement like that is, well, that people just do what they like. But of course, what Augustine was saying is, if you love God and know what it means to be loved by God, what you now like is what God likes.
One final question. I mean, you talked very well about how a law-bound life, affects us, like that older son, and it left him out missing the party. But there's also the problem of how a law-defined life, if we define God by law, I mean, there's the danger we define our life by law. That's got some dangers. But then there's the danger of if we define God by law, then what becomes God if we define him by law?
Well, I think this takes us back, doesn't it, to Exodus 20 and the reminder that this is not a list of qualifications to get in God's good books, because the relationship with God is established. So in the preface to the 10 words, it says God has redeemed this people. So these are 10 words that help people think about the shape of their relationship with God, which is already established by grace. Now, I think that many people view the rules, the laws, the commandments, in this way, that they are basically the entrance requirements for experiencing God's love. And of course, that's not the case. They are, in fact, the guidelines for living in relationship with God. It's a bit like, the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount. These are not the attitudes that qualify us for a relationship with Jesus. They are the attitudes that are displayed by people who have a relationship with Jesus.
Good, thank you. So that's just some further reflections on law. Hopefully that supplements the sermons, but thank you for joining us for this podcast.